half a millennium before the time of Christ, the Old Testament prophet Ezekiel, whilst the people of God were in exile in Babylon, longing for a seemingly impossible return to the Holy Land, had a fantastical vision of divine heavenly things, with the promise of spiritual restoration and renewal. Ezekiel's vision of the presence of God was so epic, we might say hallucinogenic, that he found it hard to describe in the book of the Bible that bears his name. He could only prefix each description of what he saw with the words, "It was like." Among those attempted descriptions, Ezekiel outlines a mystical image associated with the divine. This image had 4 faces, 4 characters we might say, each with angelic wings. The 4 living creatures, as they have come to be known, seemed to Ezekiel to be that of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, as if between them representing aspects of the character of God. Around the heavenly creatures, in Ezekiel's dream-like kaleidoscope, seemed to be further mystical aspects, including wheels that could move in any direction, adorned with all-seeing eyes. Finally, the 4 creatures reveal the centerpiece of the spiritual realm, a figure on a heavenly throne amid an aura of rainbows. Could this be God himself, or perhaps a prophetic foretelling of the coming of Jesus Christ, the centerpiece of human history? Half a millennium later, in the wake of the advent of Jesus, the Apostle John received his own apocalyptic heavenly visions, which he related in what became the concluding book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. At one point, though making no explicit reference to Ezekiel's Old Testament vision, John sees divine images as if he has been taken up to heaven, and again he sees associated with the divine presence 4 living creatures, adorned with multiple wings and a myriad of eyes. John reports that these 4 creatures were a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. Move forward nearly another half millennium, and the Christian theologian Jerome picks up on this divine heavenly vision of the 4 living creatures as depicted both by Ezekiel in the Old Testament and John in the New Testament. Jerome draws a link between the 4 mystical creatures and something else significant, of which Christianity has 4, the Gospels. Jerome suggested that in some divine, purposeful way, each of the Gospels relates to one of the creatures. Matthew's is the man, Mark's is the lion, Luke's is the ox, and John's is the eagle. Almost another half a millennium on, and a German theologian, Rabanus Maurus, developed Jerome's idea further. The concept of associating the 4 Christian Gospels of the Bible with the 4 mystical heavenly creatures became widely popular and began to be depicted in Christian art, including a rare survival from that era, the Book of Kells, Illuminated Gospels. Though not commonly touched upon nowadays, this mystical way of appreciating the four Gospels remains an acknowledged inspiration in Christian tradition. And so, in our Lent course of online reflections, we will take an overview of each of the four Gospels in the light of the vision of the heavenly four living creatures. And in our concluding fifth reflection, we will consider how this might tie in with the four classic temperaments: phlegmatic, sanguine, choleric, and melancholic, and indeed how it all might relate to each of us as Christians. Matthew the man, the gospel that rewrites humanity. Matthew's gospel is attributed to the eponymous disciple, originally known as Levi the tax collector at the time of his calling by Jesus. Matthew's gospel comes over as the official version. He launches straight in by telling us that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. He demonstrates Jesus' credentials, particularly important for the Jewish readership, starting with the founding patriarch of the Hebrew Jewish faith, Abraham, and then working steadily forwards through the generations, including again significantly King David, until we get to Jesus' earthly father, Joseph. A patriarchal human hierarchy that authenticates Jesus as the genuine article. If you want an exemplary man, a superman if you like, this is it. So we get the long opening passage before there is any biography or narrative detailing the family tree with great precision. Matthew is the only gospel to mention Jesus' symbolic name from the angel as Emmanuel, quoting from Isaiah chapter 7. Emmanuel, God with us, God present in the form of a human being, the man. We have the 3-chapter Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 to 7, outlining ideal human behaviour with a radical new agenda, illustrated by the phrase, "Love your enemies." And the passage opens with the poetic phrases of the Beatitudes, a word from the early Latin translation beati, meaning blessed, which concisely sets out an arresting, paradoxical, countercultural code of conduct, the best kind of humanity. And so in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus continues to hammer home his message of a new humanity by what he does and says, and the stories he tells, and in the end, his own life story. The parable of the sheep and goats in chapter 25 is a prime example, particularly in that it is unique to Matthew. Jesus not only highlights what good behaviour is, but suggests that it is these small acts of kindness that equate to a person's spiritual salvation. Salvation is not about belonging to the correct faith community, be that Jewish or Christian, nor about making the correct assents as to theoretical belief. Simply saying Jesus is Lord doesn't equate to salvation, but saying such things through the language of who we are is a more genuine proclamation of spiritual faith. Theologians like to jump upon one of the final lines of Matthew's Gospel as a proof text justifying the concept of the Trinity when Jesus said, "Baptize in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." But perhaps it is his phrase that follows which is the most pertinent and reflects Matthew's Gospel as a whole. Teach others to observe all the things I have outlined and highlighted for you. Chapter 28, verse 20. In other words, promote this new ideal of what it means to be human. Matthew's the man. The Gospel of Mark, the lion. The Gospel that roars. Mark's Gospel is known for its rough Greek and lack of refinement as a piece of literature, and is by far the briefest of the four Gospels. But its distinction lies in its being the pioneer Gospel written at a time when there was no New Testament, no Bible as we know it, no existing Gospels at all. Mark's is thought to be the earliest of the four, but nevertheless 3 decades after the events. One can imagine that for many years the first-hand eyewitness accounts were regaled by word of mouth frequently, until the realization came that the original apostles were dying martyrs' deaths, so the stories must be written down once and for all, for posterity. Mark himself was not an apostle, but might have been the young man also known as John, mentioned in the book of Acts. Of the very few pieces of this short gospel that are unique to Mark, one is an intriguing aside at the arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane that saw the followers flee in panic, including a young man who, in the melee and a tussle with the chief priest's mob, loses his robe completely and escapes naked. The suggestion has been made that it could have been Mark. More generally, some scholars have suggested that Mark's knowledge of events and dialogue from the life of Jesus might have been sourced, at least in part, from verbal accounts of the Apostle Peter. Mark's Gospel begins abruptly like a lion roaring, without the preambles of the other Gospels. We are introduced to John the Baptist, the wild man of the desert, who in his unkempt state and forthright preaching style must have looked and sounded something like a desert lion. But it is as if John declares, "You think I am a lion? Just wait. The real lion, the Christ, is yet to come." Indeed, Jesus, in one of the heavenly visions of the book of Revelation, is referred to as the Lion of Judah, denoting his bloodline from the patriarchs, including Judah, great-grandson of Abraham, who gave his name to one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and ultimately to the term Jew. We might say that in the Gospel of Mark, the Lion Gospel, first comes the roar of John, followed swiftly by a more profound roar from Jesus himself. Before the opening chapter is out, we are told, "The people were astonished at Jesus' teaching style, for he was teaching them as one having authority, unlike the scribes. A couple of verses later, he demonstrates that authority by confidently rebuking demons, who instantly depart with a shriek. As the gospel goes on, the lion further roars his divine authority over a whole legion of demons, and then over death itself with the raising of the daughter of a synagogue elder. And in the following chapter, the people of Jesus' hometown Nazareth cast doubt on his credentials. If we apply the symbolic analogy, it is as if they were saying, "We knew him growing up like a little kitten. How can he now be this great lion?" Whilst the Lion of Judah image lends itself to the Jesus story, Jesus hints, paradoxically, that this lion is destined for a very lowly death. And he adds a twist to his own narrative journey by coming into Jerusalem with almost comical irony, straddling a young donkey. There is a rather strange ending to Mark that in its earliest known form seems to conclude simply reporting that the women followers of Jesus were afraid after they had found his tomb empty. Verses 9 to 20 of that final chapter are a P.S. by a different author that must have been added later on. Perhaps there was a resurrection conclusion to Mark's original text that had been discreetly removed or secreted away for fear of the document falling into the wrong hands and earning serious reprisals. We might think of Mark's Gospel as a rough first draft of the Jesus story, a pioneering attempt when before there had been nothing, a taster text. But it is a courageous statement, like a lion's roar, perhaps poetically so, if coming from that young believer who had fled fearful and naked at the critical hour. Of all the Gospel writers, also known as evangelists, Dr. Luke, he was also a physician, is writing for us, we who are Gentiles, non-Jews. Perhaps the most significant thing we can say about Luke and his Gospel is that he himself was a Gentile, the only known Gentile writer of the whole Bible. He comes to the biography of Jesus with a very clear-sighted sense of purpose. He is writing for the non-Jew. He understands that the reader, listener, like him, might not come armed with a whole set of background religious knowledge, as those who are steeped in the Jewish faith. Luke begins with a massive introduction, like an overture to the symphony, filling in historic context and setting the tone for the narrative that will unfold. He spends over 150 verses on this, even before we reach the point where we meet the adult Jesus in chapter 3. Like Matthew, Luke gives us a genealogy, and in both cases they might be illustrative rather than literal, especially given that they do not precisely tally with each other. But unlike Matthew, who starts with Abraham, a great place to start for the Jewish reader, Luke does not assume that his readers know all about Abraham and the patriarchs. So he begins with Jesus and then works backwards. And he does not stop at Abraham, the Jewish founding father, but keeps going back all the way to Adam, no less. This is Luke's way of implying that Jesus doesn't belong to the Jews. He is for the whole family of humanity, all the descendants of Adam and Eve. Luke begins by addressing his narrative to his esteemed friend Theophilus. This might be a literary and indeed spiritual device. Theophilus means friend of God, which could be very clever. Luke might be saying, for those who get the message, you, the reader, the listener, are a friend of God if you wish to be. Luke's gospel is incredibly thorough. The physician takes a structured, we might say empirical, approach with clear chronology and exact, comprehensive detail. Not only this, but he follows up his gospel with a unique sequel, without which the New Testament and indeed Christianity itself would be sorely bereft. The book of the Acts of the Apostles, where he is directly involved as a companion to Paul and uses words like we and us from chapter 16 onwards. These two manuscripts combined actually constitute the largest contribution of any writer to the New Testament, even slightly more than the great Paul with his epistles. Luke takes more of a historian's approach than the other gospel writers. In the second verse of his gospel, he states that the biography of Jesus comes from first-hand oral accounts, implying that he himself is not in that category. Tellingly, the other gospel writers often recount dialogue in the present tense, as if they are reliving the action of which they were part or were observing. Luke does that only once in his gospel, when recounting an incidental teaching remark made not by Jesus but by John the Baptist. It would seem feasible that Luke, perhaps a very young man back then, had gone out to hear John in the desert, who drew very large crowds. And then quite possible that Luke was not a literal geographical follower of Jesus, but became an active believer subsequently. Luke gives the impression, as someone perhaps used to the academic approach of a physician, of having really done his homework. Much of what he presents is effectively the best bits from Matthew and Mark. But in leaving no stone unturned, he offers some unique passages found nowhere else that are quite iconic in the Jesus story, including 3 canticle pieces used in church liturgy to this day. Mary's Magnificat, father of John the Baptist, Zachariah's Benedictus, both in chapter 1, and Simeon's Nunc Dimittis from chapter 2. Also unique to Luke, from Jesus' greatest hits of parables, the Good Samaritan, chapter 10, and the Prodigal Son, chapter 15. 2 parables that are perhaps well geared to a Gentile readership. Samaritans were non-Jews with mixed Hebrew ancestry, considered inferior outsiders. But Jesus pointedly cites the Samaritan of his story as the one who is good in the eyes of God, owing to his kindness of spirit to his neighbour. And the prodigal son is perhaps a figure for the Gentiles, while the grumpy older son, who stayed at home and expresses disapproval of their father's willing forgiveness and welcome of the wayward prodigal son, is a figure for the Jewish people. These two parables are like a beating heart of Jesus' core message. So we owe Luke a debt of gratitude for alone preserving them in the canon of Jesus' teaching. At the end of the Gospel, chapter 24, Luke includes another unique and moving incident where two random followers of Jesus walking an obscure road, discussing the events that led to Jesus' crucifixion, are joined by a mysterious stranger who puts them right on what it all means and how it all tallies with sacred writings. Only when the stranger is persuaded to share supper with them and breaks bread do they realise that they are in the presence of the resurrected Christ. And then he is gone. The two believers could be Jew or Gentile. In a sense, they are every man. They are you and they are me on the journey of life, apprehended by the living Jesus. Like an ox from antiquity, ploughing with relentless care and dedication, as it were, leaving no clod unturned, Luke's methodical, outsider's approach to the gospel for the Gentiles is meticulous, thoughtful, and thorough, preparing the spiritual ground for the spiritual seed to take root. John the Eagle, the Gospel of Vision and Insight. Like an eagle soaring high above, John takes a look at the events, as if from a great height, with the perspective of an old man, many decades later. Tradition and scholarly opinion suggest that the Apostle John wrote, or perhaps of necessity dictated, his gospel in the later years of the 1st century. He was the only one of the 12, including Judas's replacement, not to be martyred. He was briefly exiled as a punishment for holding to his faith on the Greek island of Patmos, where he received the fantastical visions that form the apocalyptic book of Revelation at the end of the Bible. Tradition says he spent his senior years in the town of Ephesus, then in Greece, now in Turkey. He had written 3 short epistles included in the Bible, bearing his name. With the awareness that he was the last surviving member of the 12, he was perhaps approached for his recollections of Jesus' ministry and its significance that could be written for the benefit of believers and future generations. John's Gospel has a different character from the first 3 synoptic Gospels. His memory is perhaps typical of senior age. Far from being an academic chronology of the Jesus story, the aspects covered are very selective, with huge chunks missing, perhaps knowingly already covered by the synoptics, but with some astounding detail in the areas he does focus on, with word-for-word dialogue, even in the extensive prayerful soliloquy of Jesus in chapter 17, recounted verbatim. Perhaps many of us can testify that events in life that had a huge impact on us can be recounted in sharp detail with dialogue, or at least phrases memorized and rehearsed now and again in the memory to keep those scripts alive. Clearly, John has spent the intervening years reflecting on the spiritual and mystical meaning of what Jesus did, and moreover who he was, giving greater space in his text for such philosophical comments than do his synoptic peers. Like an eagle's view, John puts things in a greater perspective, seeing the big picture of God's purpose for the world and humanity. It is a while in his opening chapter before he even uses the word Jesus. First, he conjures grand attributes, 3 L words, as if he is saying, Jesus is greater than Jesus. This is not just a human biography. This is an outline of divine intervention in human history. The 3 L words are logos in the Greek, translated literally as the word, but really more dynamic in meaning, like expression of the divine. Secondly, light, in a spiritual divine sense. And thirdly, lamb, hinting at the mystical idea of the Christ being destined to die like a sacrifice on behalf of humanity. Indeed, when John begins to describe the actual events, his namesake, John the Baptist, sees Jesus arrive for baptism by John in the River Jordan, and then he does not say, "Oh, look everyone, it's Jesus," but rather proclaims, "Behold, the Lamb of God." And this follows straight on from the previous verse, in which John states, as if rounding off his grand introduction, "This is the Son of God." A very bold acclamation. And while John leaves out many of the classic parables and teaching of Jesus found in the synoptic Gospels, he includes a huge proportion of unique reminiscences and insights at every turn. One small example is one of the most famed verses in the whole Bible, quoted from Jesus' very personal conversation with Nicodemus, the open-minded Pharisee. "For God so loved the world, that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life." Chapter 3, verse 16. Scattered throughout John's Gospel are Jesus' "I am" sayings, found nowhere else, including "I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection. I am the good shepherd." And most shockingly for some of his listeners, Jesus commented, "Before Abraham was born, I am." He implies there is something of eternity and the divine within him, perhaps with a deliberate and provocative association with the very name of God from Jewish antiquity, the book of Exodus, "I am who I am." The sense of John's Gospel coming from the first-hand experience of one of his most intimate friends and followers is underlined when John seems to make reference to himself with the oblique phrase, "the disciple whom Jesus loved." That is, one to whom Jesus was particularly close. Intriguingly, as referenced in the previous Luke section in my reflections, John makes frequent use of the word says, the Greek equivalent, rather than said, in his noting specific dialogue, as if reliving the action in his own mind, like being there again vividly in the present moment. Perhaps it is unfortunate that English translations tend to alter this detail, putting everything in the past tense for the sake of grammatical correctness. the word says in the text would restore an exciting immediacy to these vibrant accounts. For Christians for whom the practice of Holy Communion has become a central feature, it might seem odd that John does not highlight at all the bread and wine at the Last Supper, nor quote Jesus' iconic words in that regard, "Do this in remembrance of me." But he does instead highlight a significant alternative aspect to the pre-Good Friday private gathering of Jesus and his disciples. Chapter 13 has Jesus at the supper, getting down on his hands and knees in servant mode and rinsing the disciples' dusty, sandal-shod feet. The chapter concludes with Jesus remarking, "Love one another as I have loved you." In other words, like a willing servant. Perhaps the Church has missed something by not adopting ceremonial foot washing, or at least a symbolic hand rinsing in its liturgical traditions. It was recorded by 2nd century Christian historian Irenaeus that in his dotage John would whisper over and over again to anyone who would listen, "Little children, love one another," as if he saw that as the core tenet of Jesus' teaching. We might say the spirit of the foot-washing episode. It is impossible to quantify how bereft Christian understanding would be without the grand perspective of spiritual insight John's Gospel throws on the Jesus story. We must be grateful that from an almost heavenly viewpoint, high above the symbolic man, the lion, and the ox, there soared an eagle. We have 4 Gospels, each offering a varied take and perspective on the Jesus story. Imagine picking up 4 different newspapers on the same day. They would give distinctive presentations, highlight their own chosen aspects of current events, and each give a unique slant with their reports and comment and interpretation. And there, of course, would be some areas of common ground and overlap, and perhaps verbatim direct quotations, though framed in different ways. We are blessed to have 4 ancient, contemporary gospel accounts that together provide a broad overview for posterity and the ongoing, unfolding journeys of faith for each new generation of believers, followers, and for the curious inquirer. 4 is a good number. 4 seasons, 4 points of the compass, and traditionally, in classical understanding of the human psyche going back several centuries before the time of Christ, 4 temperaments. These are known as choleric, sanguine, phlegmatic, and melancholic. There is a long-established popular understanding that each of us has a natural, predisposed bias towards one of these temperaments predominantly, perhaps with some lesser elements of the other 3 thrown in for good measure. We might apply the 4 temperaments to the 4 Gospels as a way of appreciating something of each of their primary qualities and value. The choleric is a forceful temperament, well organised, a natural leader, clear-sighted and assertive. Perhaps the dominant one of the 4. We might link the choleric temperament with Matthew, the man, which takes first place in gospel order and makes a clear declaration as to precisely who this Jesus is and where he stands in human history. The sanguine temperament can be hot-headed and extrovert, the life and soul of the party, eager and willing, perhaps impulsive, but also bold when required, a risk-taker. This is Mark, the lion, the earliest gospel to be written, a pioneer of gospel writing when it was dangerous to put one's Christian head above the parapet. Mark, the lion, launches in without much ceremony and no preamble, full of arresting bluster that grabs the attention straight away, and in the end seems to finish just as abruptly. The phlegmatic temperament is easygoing, wishes to please, not dominant but fits in well, even-handed, perhaps noticing the underdog. It might have a tendency to just quietly get on till the job is done. This is Luke, the ox. Luke comes after Matthew and Mark, but crucially covers important detail that underlines the gospel message as being inclusive for the non-Jew. Luke, the ox, is thorough and quietly keeps going till the comprehensive work is complete. Not just the gospel itself, but the unique book of Acts to boot. The melancholic temperament is nominally associated with sadness and tragedy and perhaps looking glum, but really it has more to do with being a deep reflector. Someone who notices the detail, considers everything, and will only speak when or if the more extrovert types have exhausted their verbosity. This is John the eagle. He spent an entire lifetime, decades worth of reflection before putting pen to paper. His portrait of Jesus is intimate, poignant, thoughtful, with more profound insight than the earlier three Gospels. As we conclude, a question for each of us to ponder. Which of the four Gospels do I feel most drawn to, and why? And perhaps a supplementary question. Do I have a favourite Gospel phrase, verse or passage? And if so, why?